You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes over and bulldozed their villages, seized their property and their laws? They had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 344 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. On today's show, I'm talking about the trial of Julian Assange, the expanding role of the U.S. military on the southern border enforcing immigration law, and the war in Afghanistan. Please take the time to share the show or recommend it to a friend. The best place to find the show online is at the Libertarian Institute, where the show and my daily news roundup are featured on the homepage in the right-hand column. Once you've listened to a couple shows and realize you like it, make sure you subscribe to it somewhere. YouTube, Stitcher, Spotify, iTunes. Give it a rating and review while you're there. Of course, on the show, what I do is I update current events, kind of news story type thing. So the way you get the most out of it is by catching, every episode. All right, last, if you want to donate to the show, you could do that at patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. All right, here we go. What we have first is that Assange has been sentenced in a UK court, and this is for the trial surrounding him violating his bail conditions. So the way I understand this story, and it's kind of jumbled to me just because I can't remember to way back then, but essentially what happened is I guess there's a couple allegations of sexual abuse or something similar to that against Assange in Sweden, and so he ends up being placed under bail conditions in the UK. Those charges have since been withdrawn, but while Assange is under the bail conditions in the UK, it becomes quite apparent that the U.S. government is really looking into Assange and possibly planning to press charges against him up to and including the Espionage Act, which could carry the death penalty. And so for that reason, he decides to seek asylum in the Ecuadorian embassy in order to continue his work as a journalist and exercising, the right of free speech, which, is recognized by international standards as a, fundamental human right. By doing this, though, Assange is jumping his bail conditions sent by the, UK and never shows up to his court date. Assange has said several times, by the way, that he is always willing to go kind of face his accusers and defend himself in Sweden. The problem is that Sweden has a pretty liberal extradition deal with the United States, so concerned that he would just kind of be swooped up and, sent off even to Guantanamo Bay or something like that. I mean, there's no guarantee that that wouldn't happen. Assange isn't a U.S. citizen, which kind of scratches your head as how could the U.S. government charge, a foreigner for the, under the Espionage Act and possessing classified information, but essentially that's kind of what they're going at here. So the judge sentences him to 50 weeks. The maximum sentence was 52 weeks. Again, the judge really chastises him for this, and I believe Assange says again here, that I'm not trying to get off from, the kind of allegations from Sweden or jump bail in the UK. I'm just trying to prevent myself from being shipped off to the US. You all know my stance on, Assange being a journalist and all that. So I'm not going to get into that on today's show. I will link to a past episode of the show where I explain, in more of my, detail my position on Assange. There's an episode with Will Porter and I'll link to that one. Now, I believe the extradition hearing for Assange has been moved to the end of May around that time. I guess he is getting some kind of meetings with his legal team at this point. So hopefully he's able to craft some kind of defense for himself here. Depending who you listen to, this could go a million different ways. I've seen some people, expressing optimism that, hey, the, court system in the UK is corrupt, but it is still the UK, and with enough, kind of public outcry and demand for transparency and fairness in the trial, he could get a real trial here and be sent free on his way. It's just a matter of when the State Department CIA plane lands in the UK and they ship him off in the middle of the night, and, who knows where he could end up going. So I really don't understand enough about this yet. And, the thing is probably nobody knows for sure. And I think a lot of it will depend on how much demand for transparency there is with this process. If the UK media is talking about every day and, all of these kind of what would be seen, I think, as more minor rulings and stuff like that are really displayed, then, maybe you could hope to have more fairness in the trial. So I don't know. I guess there's reason to be optimistic, but at the same time, there is I think still a sense of desperation and urgency here with Assange, as he is essentially doing what journalists do. What he's doing and what I'm doing, while in scale and importance and everything else are certainly vastly different. At the end of the day, the goal, I think, of both of us is to bring information to people. And, from my perspective, I think if I were given information that I thought exposed crimes, I'm put out there. On to immigration stuff, and the reason I talk about it on the show Foreign Policy Focus is because the U.S. military is playing a growing role there. So one of my concerns on immigration is this is a diehard position of Donald Trump. He ran on build the wall, and enforcing border policy is something that, an immigration law is something that I'm guessing he feels like he has to be able to achieve. And so because of this, we've seen the U.S. deploy some troops to the southern border, and it was just going to be a short time to put up some fencing, and it expands and they add more troops. And then Donald Trump takes a bunch of money from the Pentagon and reassigns it to the border by declaring a national emergency. And, I see that as a real power grab by the president. And it also attributes to this $4 billion budget shortfall for the Air Force. They're saying they need $4 billion or else their combat, planes' operational abilities will not be as ready. Now, this is one of those things that's always unbelievable, is that anytime the government's going to have to cut something because of budget constraints, they always go to, the most immediate thing first. Oh, there's not going to be books in the children's section of the library if, the county budget is $100,000 short. The solution is never to cut some administrative positions or anything like that. Nope. They go right to the thing that would seem most essential to Americans, the combat readiness of the U.S. I think they bring up the nuclear bombers, being more limited because it's ridiculous. Like, their budget is gigantic. If they really want cuts, I'm sure they could find a way to keep the planes in the air. But anyways, now at least the length of the time the U.S. active duty, Army, these aren't National Guard guys, because there's a couple thousand of those down there too. But there's also thousands now of U.S. troops and 300 more incoming that are down at the border. And while, the initial role was more, I think, kind of construction projects and stuff that I think a lot of Americans were able to struggle at, whatever, that role is growing. These new deployment are going to have more contact with the migrants, I guess, be driving buses, providing medical care, serving food. But this is, just the examples that they're giving. We don't know how, maybe more involved they're going to be in enforcing immigration law. And also, as I just pointed out here, we have this whole trend towards doing more and more with the U.S. military at the border. At what point does Trump take that step and actually have them, out there armed and trying to force immigration law? Now, and this might be the kind of thing where a lot of people think about it and they're like, well, it's the military. If people are jumping over the border, then that's a military thing to do. But I don't know if that's going to be the case. It may be nice to think that these guys will just be stationed at the border and stopping people who are, literally falling over the fence. But it may also mean that there's going to be U.S. Army patrols in towns close to the southern border asking Americans to show them their ID while they carry around guns. I mean, this is kind of military police state stuff we're kind of really walking very close to right now. We know we've seen reports in the past that this is something that Donald Trump has advocated. With all the, I guess, misreporting about his administration, I should be careful there, because I believe this did come from Politico, which it's been wrong about stuff that Trump has said in the past. But either way, that's the direction we're trending in. I think very dangerous. And then there's also this case that I would like to try to find more detail about, but haven't been able to. But I guess a few weeks ago, U.S. military personnel were detained by Mexican, I don't know what kind of law enforcement, south of the U.S. border wall, but apparently it was still north of the actual border. So they were on American territory, but south of the wall. This caused some confusion. I don't think this border is very straight at all. So I'm guessing that it's pretty easy to kind of like misread a map or think you're in one place when you're actually in another one. And I don't think the terrain is super forgiving. I think it's a lot of desert and stuff like that here. But apparently, these military patrol were armed when they were stopped. And, trying to figure out what they were actually doing down there, it would be interesting to me. So, worst news I got for you today's show, and that is the override vote in the Senate of Trump's Yemen War Powers bill veto has failed. Talk about massive power grabs by the president. The reason that every single Republican in the Senate, I guess not all of them are actually even, give lip service to the Constitution, but a lot of them do. And a lot of them say that we support the Constitution. And this is one of the biggest power grabs by the president maybe so far. Donald Trump asserting that he has the right to veto a war powers resolution, which was the majority in both houses of Congress telling the president that he can no longer move forward with a war that wasn't explicitly authorized by Congress in the first place. This was Congress absolutely stepping up and asserting its constitutional powers over the president. The checks and the balances, the check on the war power is that Congress makes the wars. And Congress said, we don't make this war, you need to stop it. And the president vetoed it. And so essentially what that says is that you have to read the Constitution as the president could start any war he wants. And so long as 2/3 majority in both houses of Congress don't vote to override it, then we could continue that war. It's absolutely insane policy, and it's a insane standard. And I don't know, maybe there's a case to be made at the Supreme Court here, but I'm sure that would take forever anyways. All the while, the Yemeni people are dropping dead on the daily. It's unbelievable over there. At this point, even the UN is starting to move towards ACLED's numbers, which is really close now to 100,000 recorded deaths from this war. And you have who knows how many other children starving to death. Save the Children is saying a Yemeni child is dropping dead every 10 minutes of a preventable cause. Things like cholera because the water treatment facility has been blown up, and Saudi Arabia, backed by the United States, isn't allowing chlorine tablets into the country. Medical facilities have all been destroyed, so even in the fortunate circumstance that a child has gotten cholera, they can't make it to the hospital because it's been destroyed by an airstrike. Certainly the Houthis, who the U.S. and Saudi Arabia are opposing in this war, have, committed crimes against the civilian population as well. But when you actually look at the situation here, in that the Houthis don't have an air force, and while they do have some leftover ballistic missile, I think some armored vehicles, a lot of them actually stolen from the Saudi backed forces. And, they do have more military capabilities than, I guess, the Taliban, but not by a whole lot. And so, they're almost fighting an insurgency here where they control the highlands of Yemen, which includes a large portion of that country's population, which is, just being starved to death because of this war. But to get back to the kids here, so many of them, I'm sure, are suffering from trauma and PTSD, as not only has this war included that blockade, but also a vicious air war for years. Saudi Arabia is constantly bombing the capital city, Sana'a, and the Houthi stronghold of Sadr. But at the same time, they have absolutely no ground forces to go and take these cities from the Houthis. And so, they're carrying out these airstrikes, but they're making absolutely no progress. And since it's been going on for over 4 years, it's just a war of terror against the civilians for absolutely no purpose. Now you have this guy, Joe Biden, and man, there's so many terrible things I want to say about him. I'm all worked up about Yemen. Let me restrain myself a little bit and just get into the news here. And that is, he says he wants to end support for that Saudi-led war in Yemen. Now, I see this guy as a coward. And I really don't think that if he becomes president, he would actually end this war, even if he promised it, unless it became one of his central campaign pillars, because, stopping genocide is just so popular that even, the blind American people would support it, especially if Joe Biden was, running on it. And they actually may demand that he follow through with that because what's going on in Yemen is so terrible. But I don't think he has any intention of really following through with it. And if he realized the thing was so stupid, he had 4 years, 2 of them as vice president, well, 1.5, that he could have ended this war, or at least came out against it. And we certainly know that Joe Biden had a lot of swing in the Obama administration. I think a lot of what was seen as shifting Obama's position on gay marriage was kind of Biden coming out before him and saying it. And so if Biden had come out as vice president, even in late 2016, even when Obama's the lame dunk and said, hey, we're waging this really brutal genocide right now in Yemen and we should really end it, Obama probably would have been forced to. But now him, like Samantha Power, who was UN ambassador at the time, said nothing when they had the power to do something. And now that they're out of power, finally willing to kind of stand up and say, hey, maybe we should end this genocide. Although neither of them, I don't think, really used that strong of language. Biden certainly didn't. If there's one candidate who I think can maybe bring a stop to this, well, probably two, Bernie Sanders and Tulsi Gabbard. I think this may be something that Bernie would follow through on just because it's so easy to do and there's really no downside. And I think his base, may really push him on it. Tulsi seems really bound to this position, as well. So another place where Trump has, I think, made some real dangerous moves as president. First, by naming the IRGC as a terrorist organization, which is a branch of the Iranian army. And by doing this, it's allowed for more sanctions. And I think in reality, is probably going to at some time be used, at least covertly, to justify hostile U.S. actions against the IRGC. Even if, it's covert CIA, they may say, oh yeah, well, the 2001 AUMF gives us the ability to go after terrorist organizations. Iran kept a couple Al-Qaeda members under house arrest. Therefore, Iran supports Al-Qaeda. And, now we could take out these, IRGC members or something like that. Trump is now looking at naming the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization, which is a political movement that stretches across the Middle East. I'm sure it would be an endorsement from al-Sisi to carry out some pretty brutal crackdowns of his opposition in Egypt. It would be interesting to see what happened in Yemen, where the Al-Islah party is actually backed by Saudi Arabia. The Qataris are big backers, I believe, of the Muslim Brotherhood, and so that may cause some conflict there. But, this is a group that stretches, I think, throughout most of the Muslim world. And while I'm sure there are definitely some people who profess membership to the Muslim Brotherhood who have carried out, terrorist acts, at least in large part, this is a political movement and it's not a part of their ideology. Although it is, definitely a very conservative branch, from my understanding of Islam. And I would not personally like to live in a government run by the Muslim Brotherhood. Although, Muslim Brotherhood versus al-Sisi or Saudi Arabia or something like that, then you're maybe faced with a little bit of worse of two decisions to make, but Muslim Brotherhood could be better for some people. And that's why it's not a terrorist organization. The commander of the Guantanamo Bay torture facility has been fired by the Trump administration. I guess they have a new replacement on the way. The U.S. is making something of a strategic move in Europe and Asia right there, where the U.S. has growing diplomatic tensions with Turkey, especially, with the growing power of Erdogan and as I've discussed on the show, Turkey's commitment to buy the S-400 system, and that's causing them to be kicked out of the F-35 process, which Turkey is actually a production member of. They, I think, build some of the seats. And then there's a split between U.S. and Turkey on Syria policy and what to do about the Syrian Kurds. And you can find past episodes of the show on, Syria and the S-400. Maybe I'll link to a couple of the show notes page if you want to know more about that. But Turkey also has longstanding issues with its European neighbor Greece over a bunch of islands out in the sea that separates the two. I think there's hundreds, if not thousands of islands out there, and they all have different territorial claims. And I'm not quite sure what all the significance of these claims are. Maybe there's natural resources underneath. Maybe they're tourist destinations. I don't know. I know this causes a split between Greece and Turkey. And now that the U.S. has drifted away from Turkey and our ability to carry out missions from the Incirlik Air Base there, the Air Force is looking at doing more of those operations out of the U.S. base in Greece. Long run, this may be nothing more than just kind of a logistical thing. Oh, it's that much further to the Middle East from Greece than from Turkey. Although it could cause Greece to feel, more emboldened in their territorial claims here. And there have been very near brush-ups recently between Turkey and Greece in the past couple of years. All right, updates on the Venezuela coup, which seems, I guess, to officially be declared dead. I had a real question at the time of how could they have possibly thought this was going to work? They have 30, I've seen 30, 60, 100 maybe, kind of low-ranking military personnel, potentially one, I wouldn't say high-ranking military personnel, but, an officer type who possibly defected over. But apparently, the opposition, the U.S. government coup plotters, Bolton, Abrams, were under the belief that the Supreme Court chief of Venezuela, the defense secretary, our defense minister, and then the leader of the National Guard were all going to turn against Maduro as well. And they didn't. And so, maybe they got cold feet, Maduro found out and prevent this from happening. Or it could have been that Maduro let this go along. It could be the explanation then for why Maduro had a fueled up plane on the tarmac. Maybe he was really trying to sell the idea that, there was this coup attempt against him that was going to be successful because, it really did fizzle pretty poorly here. Lopez is now hiding, I believe, in the Spanish embassy after leaving the Chilean one. Guaido, I believe, is still a free man. But, this coup attempt kind of shows that he has no ability to overthrow Maduro. 100% failure, didn't get very much support on his side. Another possibility I thought of is that the U.S. may have known, and this was just an attempt, maybe a little bit more conspiratorial thought of mine of Bolton or Abrams orchestrating a policy that they thought was unlikely to succeed, but to kind of then be like, well, Mr. President, we've tried everything, and there's no way to do this without a military force, so guess who's going in next? There's a lot of talk about U.S. military plans going into Venezuela, and, a lot of U.S. officials kind of vaguely saying that nothing's off the table to certainly imply the U.S. may be considering going to war with Venezuela, but whenever the Pentagon is officially asked, they usually say no. I think that about catches us up to date on what happened in Venezuela. I haven't seen too much other fallout so far. Maybe more to develop on over the weekend and stuff on NetSuite's shows there. North Korea, two kind of interesting statements. One out of North Korea saying that they expect the United States to offer a more acceptable denuclearization deal by the end of the year, or face, I think the wording that at least was translated as undesired consequences. Now, I suppose undesired consequences could mean just about anything. It would be very undesirable for North Korea to nuke anyone. It would also be undesirable for North Korea to test a new weapon. So I'm guessing that the range of what that undesired consequence could be is somewhere in that realm. I think it's an interesting play by North Korea to kind of, call now out the U.S. on an international stage and say, hey, offer us an acceptable agreement. Now, the problem is that I think John Bolton has a lot of power over U.S. foreign policy right now. And he says that the position of Donald Trump is that it's only unilateral talks with North Korea. Because who knows, maybe if Russia and China get involved in talks, something could actually get done here. They would be able to give assurances to Donald Trump that, they could either monitor North Korea's nuclear programs or give different kinds of security guarantees that helps everybody feel more comfortable with any kind of agreement. And then Bolton also says that Trump doesn't want a step-by-step process. This is a problem. It's got to be a step-by-step process, I think. I think the Iran nuclear deal and, the Libyan-style denuclearization that, I don't know if we could say that's what killed Gaddafi, but certainly ends up, a few years later with a dead Gaddafi. So, I'm guessing that the policy of North Korea is going to be, we normalize relations and get security guarantees as we give up our weapons, not after. The U.S. is sailing more warships through the Taiwan Strait. I don't understand why they keep doing this, to be honest. If anybody has any articles explaining it, it seems extremely provocative to me. It's something that I think definitely upsets China, and unnecessarily so. It seemed before that there was almost like a okay feeling between all parties involved to have it happen once a year. That, I guess, kind of asserts the territorial claims of Taiwan and the U.S.'s ability to sail the ships through the Taiwan Strait, but at the same time isn't happening so frequently that China's like, hey, the U.S. keeps sailing, these, great military ships. I think they've been guided missile destroyers before, right off the coast of our country. And, the reason it's so important to China is they believe in a one China policy. And that means Taiwan is part of China. And that means that the small gap of water between China and Taiwan is Chinese territorial waters, not international waters of any kind or Taiwanese waters. And the Americans have no authority to sail through it. Afghanistan news, another round of talks have been kicked off in Qatar between the U.S. and the Taliban. A few weeks ago, I read that talks fell apart, and this was because I think the Afghan government was going to attend the round of talks, and they came up with this ridiculous guest list, and then tried to bring too many people to the talks, and the Taliban said, hell no, and left. These talks seem to, move along, and then the U.S. will try to do something that in some way goes back on what they had already agreed to do, and the Taliban say, nope, we're leaving then. And then a few weeks later, the U.S. comes back to the table. So there is progress being made. It seems like very slow, but this is now the sixth round of talks. And maybe soon we start hearing talks of a ceasefire, something like that. I think good things could happen here if talks keep on going. The special investigator for the Afghan war, I believe the acronym there is SIGAR. And they put out a report, and it says that Iron Tempest, which was the U.S. bombing campaign, I believe started in November 2017 against the Taliban opium labs, was an absolute waste of resources. So another failed U.S. policy in Afghanistan and just another reason to leave. And then, that report goes on to say is that this was predictable. All the experts were saying like, hey, here's what you're doing. You're flying an F-22 Raptor, which costs who knows how many thousands of dollars an hour in fuel, and, dropping very expensive bombs on structures that are maybe $500 to set up. So there's no way that this could possibly be successful. I'm linked to this in the show notes page, but Scott Horton and Robert Gaines have another article out, this one in the National Interest, just explaining that there's no victory for the U.S. in Afghanistan. It's well written, so in the show notes page, I suggest all of you go out there and read it. The F-35 has been used in battle for the first time. I mean, what a joke this is, right? We had the most expensive U.S. military project in history, and the first time it's used in battle, it goes and flies somewhere over the desert in Iraq and attempts to blow up a couple of tunnels dug by ISIS. What a waste of money this all is. And how much is, ripping all of us regular people off, to benefit the weapons makers. Again, making trillion-dollar plane projects to go, destroy some tunnel somewhere in the middle of the desert in Iraq. How that tunnel could ever be a threat to an American is, beyond insane, other than the fact that we have all of our troops over there trying to kill them. So maybe that's, I guess, spurs somebody to make a video telling somebody else to go kill, some innocent Americans or something like that. But, sure, that absolutely no threat to the United States. And then we take this super expensive plane and we go out there with all this fancy and smart equipment and we try to blow up a tunnel that, may have been dug by a shovel under the, like I said, desert in Iraq. I saw reports here that a Turkish soldier was apparently killed by a Syrian Kurdish fighter, a member of the YPG. I'm looking for more confirmation on that, but if it's true, this is going to be another real problem for the U.S. in trying to get along with Turkey, and also trying to resolve what the hell to do in northern Syria now, as you have Turkey, Al-Qaeda, Syria, Russia, the United States, the Syrian Kurds, all with separate interests, all competing to get kind of the best deals to resolve this whole mess of the Syrian civil war. Last thing, I'm linked to this one in the show notes page. It's actually from the Washington Post. Good write-up on Kenyan vets of the Somali war suffering from PTSD and then not really getting any treatment. Apparently the Kenyan army has no mental health treatment at all. And, so it's important to remember that, when we say that we're going to use, kind of our Arab allied forces to go kill ISIS or anything like that, it also means that we're putting people, and paying people and pushing people to go to war where they're going to suffer from trauma. And there's probably not going to be enough care for it on the back end. Just, I don't know. They're a terrible part of the U.S. foreign policy. All right, there you go. Hope you like the shows this week. foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, libertarianinstitute.org, immersionnews.com, It looks like the LP Mises Caucus is running some of my content again, so check out their website. They always have a lot of great libertarian stuff up there, including my daily news roundups and some of my shows. Foreign Policy Focus is on patreon.com, so donate to the show there if you want, at KYAAALE on Twitter. And that's it. Thanks, everyone.